I'd like to say that we have to change the order of presentation because interpretation trouble. The first presentation, Kubota, second, David Cobblestone, third presenter, Skada. Skada 先生、じゃあ、進めていただけ。今回の座長を務めます、会でございます。ICRP の委員をしております。塚田先生、お願いします。
はい、紹介ありがとうございます。それではセッション1の3、環境影響及び事故に付随する社会的、倫理的問題ということで、今、甲斐先生からご説明がありましたように、最初に久保田先生、次に、ストーンさん、で、最後に私ということになります。それでは、久保田さん、どうぞよろしくお願いします。
はい、どうもありがとうございます。共有しない。あれ共有しないよ。共有できない。他の人も共産してる。
事務局の方、画面外してください。
すみません、共有ちょっとできないんですけど。
そうですね。事務局の方、はい、できると思います。よろしくお願いします。
ここじゃない、ここに共有。すみません、どうもありがとうございました。それでは、福島に生息する野ネズミの染色体異常について、私の研究を紹介させていただきます。東京電力福島第一原子力発電所事故によって汚染した地域に生息する生物は、
I am going to present on chromosomal aberrations in wild mice inhibiting in Fukushima Prefecture. So, wildlife inhibiting areas contaminated by F1 nuclear power accident has received long-term radiation at low dose rate. What is the most sensitive biological indicator for long-term radiation exposure at low dose rate? Almost all of biological changes induced by irradiation at low dose rate, such as DNA strand breaks, are restored immediately. However, the changes as a result to the rare misrepair do not disappear, and gene mutation, chromosome aberration, and tumor may occur. Genetically identical or approximate control is required for gene mutation. In case of tumor, we need a lot of samples, and tumors are one of the late effects of irradiation. It's relatively difficult to find out tumors in wild mice with rather short lifespan. So, chromosome aberration, we do not have any restraint. It's an excellent indicator. Let me talk about this chromosome aberration test. Here in the diagram, you can see with irradiation, there is excision of DNA strands. In one strand, there may be reciprocal combination that will occur with certain possibility. And when this cell divides, there are two types of aberration. One is in the chromosome, there are centromere in both. And one chromosome has two centromere. The other chromosome do not have any centromere. This is dicentric type. Translocation type even is maintained stable even through cell division. Dicentric aberration is unstable because it disappears through cell division. So, to look at this chromosome aberration using lymphocyte, as long as the cell does not die out, chromosome aberration induced by irradiation are retained. Lymphocytes do not die out for a prolonged period of time in vivo and not proliferate, an advantage for dicentric assay. Methods to observe the chromosomes of lymphocytes ex vivo have been already established. So in our research, we looked at wild mice and we looked at the spleen. So let me explain about where we caught the wild mice. So in heavily contaminated area, we chose 3 different areas with different contamination, different dose. One is 3 kilometers west of the nuclear plant. And as of July 2012, the dose was 81 millisievert. This is heavily contaminated area. And 15 kilometers northwest from the plant, it's 31 microsievert. We defined it as moderately contaminated area. And 28 kilometers south from the plant, 0.5 microsievert, it's defined as slightly contaminated area. And so in case of small Japanese field mice, we caught only in July 2012. And for the large field mice, we caught from this period. And estimation of absorbed dose. So here we looked at chromosome aberration. Is it due to the eradication? So this estimation is quite important. Total absorbed dose rate is internal absorbed dose rate plus external absorbed dose rate. Total absorbed dose is total absorbed dose rate multiplied by 24 hours and age in days. Estimation of absorbed dose to wild mice. Internal absorbed dose, we used ERICA tool. For external absorbed dose, average ambient dose rate inhabitant multiplied by 1.138. This coefficient between ambient dose rate and absorbed dose rates, which were measured using glass rod dosimeters embedded in the abdominal space of wild mice carcasses left on ground. Age in days is comprehensively estimated based on the information about the tooth aberration, body size, and usual birth dates. In case of the field mice, we used a chromosome sample stained with C-band, and this is quite clear. So we can conduct dicentric test. This is the dicentric aberration. In 2012 July, we looked at these slightly, moderately, heavily contaminated area, and we looked at this dicentric percentage. In the heavily contaminated caught mouse, we found high percentage of dicentrics. In the moderately contaminated area, average absorbed dose rate was 1.13 and average absorbed date was 188. In the highly contaminated area, average absorbed dose was 2.72 per day. Average absorbed dose was 749 milligray. So the dose rate, we found the dose rate probably necessary for the dicentric aberration. Now look at the isolation of chromosomes. In the field mice, we found this, and in the large field mice, we could not find any dicentrics. So in the large field mice, we could not find this. We could not conduct this test. So we used the fish assay specific for this large field mice. So we looked at large chromosome, number 1, number 2, number 5, and number 3 and 4. We could isolate these chromosomes. For chromosome 3 and 4, they were mixed. So based on these chromosomes, we developed the fish probes. We looked at number 1, number 2, number 5. So 3 colored fish test. And we looked at the vulnerability. We found vulnerability on chromosome number 2. So we found out that there's a high background. So then we looked at chromosome number 1, number 3, number 5, and number 4 and 5. We conducted 4-color fish test. So this 4-color chromosome fish assay was used for large field mice. So you can see red is chromosome 1, chromosome 3 is light green, chromosome 4 is deep green, chromosome 5 is yellow. You can see on the right hand photo, number 1 and number 3, they developed mutual recombination. And so we looked at the large field mouse aberrations. You can see in the heavily contaminated area, we found statistically significant aberrations. In other areas, these were not statistically significant. This is the same result as field mice. And we looked at the chronological changes in aberrations, 2012 and 2014. These were significantly higher aberrations. However, in 2016, we did not see any differences with other areas. So let me go on to summary. Chromosome aberrations in splenic lymphocytes of wild mice inhibiting in Fukushima Prefecture have been investigated as a sensitive biological indicator of radiation effects. Wild mice were captured first in July 2012. Chromosome aberrations were examined by dicentric assay in A. argentus and 3-color and 4-color fish assay in A. speciosus. The frequency of chromosomal aberration was significantly higher in both mice, inhibiting in highly contaminated area. In other areas, ambient dose rate was approximately 80 millisievert per hour. The interannual variability in frequency of chromosomal aberration in A. speciosus inhibiting the heavily contaminated area was studied by 4-color fish assay. The frequencies in 2012 and 2014 were significantly higher, but that in 2016 was not. And rough estimation of the relationship between dose rate and chromosome aberrations indicates that a significant increase in frequency of chromosomal aberrations can be observed in wild mice exposed to radiation at absorbed dose rate of more than 1 milligray per day and absorbed dose more than 200 milligray. These findings are consistent with the result of studies on long-term exposure of radiation to laboratory mice reported by Tanaka K.A.L. So the result was the same as that of increase in aberration at 1 milligray per day to 600 days. So considering the longevity of wild mice, it is unlikely that the increase in frequency of chromosomal aberration observed in wild mice inhabiting the heavily contaminated area of Fukushima may correlate with any other biological effects such as tumor incidence. Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank the organisers for the opportunity to come and talk to you today. My name is David Copplestone, and along with my colleague Nick Beresford, we have put together some information to help us to consider what we can learn from the environmental impacts from past accidents. The information contained in the presentation is drawn from a number of sources and includes reference to the work of other colleagues who have been conducting research in this area, and we would like to acknowledge their contribution to this presentation. So to start off with, why should we improve our understanding of environmental impacts, and how might this help us in the future? Well, there are a number of reasons, some of which are mentioned on the slide. Some key ones are to help us to better understand the consequences of controlled or accidental releases of radioactive materials to the environment from any source, for example a nuclear licensed site, a hospital or a research facility. These can be in the form of planned exposure situations, so that's the deliberate release of radioactive materials under a permit. They might be under emergency exposure situations when an unregulated release might occur during an accident, or it might be as an existing exposure situation where we need to assess the need to bring a site under control. In all of these situations, understanding the potential environmental impacts will aid our decision making on what the appropriate action to be taken for a given situation is. We also need to be able to ensure the support and understanding from stakeholders, including those who may be directly affected by the radioactive releases, members of the public and other interested parties. This confidence can be undermined by the conflicting results that coming out from field-based studies, particularly in areas affected by past accidents. So we need to try to understand why we're getting these different results, and where appropriate, take those results into account when deriving criteria for use in radiological risk assessments. Increasingly also, there are concerns over the global loss of biodiversity, and there is a need to therefore conserve species and habitats, and that's often a key driver in our requirement to undertake radiological assessments of the environment. So we need to better understand any potential role that the radioactive releases may play in any biodiversity reductions. It is worth noting here that for planned releases of radioactivity, it is extremely unlikely that radiation will have a significant impact, but we need to be able to determine this with appropriate evidence and assessments. Doing so could enable the continued use of radioactive materials, for example within medical use, but also to support the potential use of nuclear power as a low carbon source of electricity. Past accidents can of course provide us with the opportunity to study potential higher levels of radioactivity in the environment than we might normally encounter. This is of course unfortunate, and we would prefer them not to be there in the first place. But where they are there, they provide situations where there may have been radiation exposures that could have caused mortality in wildlife present in those areas that were contaminated at the time of the accident. There then may be subsequent recovery of their populations through migration into highly contaminated areas, or because of the highly heterogeneous nature of the contamination that may be present. So there may be pockets where animals might spend their time which are relatively uncontaminated, and they may transit through areas of higher contamination, or vice versa. Consequently, these field sites provide opportunities to study how organisms may utilize contaminated areas, how they may adapt biologically to the increased radiation levels, and how ecological systems themselves may recover, and indeed, at an extreme level, how ecological systems might recover in the absence of humans. Currently, within ICRP, we are also looking to see whether we might learn from decisions made during past accidents or incidents, to see whether there are aspects that we can learn from about how the environment has been impacted or how it's benefited from the remediation decisions that have been made, with a view to trying to embed aspects of environmental decision making into any future emergency preparedness planning. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go through lots of examples of how and what we can learn from past accidents. Instead, we've attempted to pull out some key examples to illustrate some of the key points. In this first example, taken from Stas Gerazarkin and colleagues' work in Chernobyl, we can see that this is a summary of our knowledge of the different types of radiation effects at different dose rates, in this case in grays per year. As we might expect at lower dose rates, the types of effects are related to genetic effects. Then as we progressively increase the radiation exposure, we see morphological aberrations, then it moving into reproductive and finally mortality type effects. This basic knowledge allows us to build up a picture of the likely impacts of radiation exposure across different dose rates in the field, and thus can be used to help us to test any derived criteria for risk assessment, such as those that are marked on the figure, although information that's been used to produce the International Commission on Radiological Protection's derived consideration reference levels, which are indicated on the bottom of the screen. Those indicate dose rate ranges where detrimental effects of radiation might start to be seen. We can therefore use these field data to test and investigate whether these criteria, such as the DCRLs, are in the right place. We can also test and develop our thinking about the underpinning biological mechanisms that give rise to the observed effects, and we can then think about whether populations within these contaminated environments might show signals, for example, of transgenerational effects, which are not easily done under laboratory conditions. We can also think about the inconvenient truths of some of these field-based studies, where you might see reports, often that are picked up by the media, that suggest that there will be or are major impacts on wildlife. Then there may be other studies that show that the wildlife may be flourishing, especially in the absence of humans within exclusion zones around contaminated areas. But the question is, what is the reality? Here you can see some stories from Chernobyl, but we also see this around Fukushima as well. As with most things, there is truth, no doubt, in both sets of studies. There have been and may still be no doubt about the effects on wildlife in areas around these major accidents, certainly at the time of the accidents when the radiation levels were high. Similarly, we can see effects around other past instances, such as those from weapons testing. Furthermore, these effects often fit the preconceived theories or concerns that radiation exposure must lead to negative impacts, and there are data to support these. But equally, it may be that there are more important environmental stresses out there, e.g. the presence of humans, and that in the absence of humans, wildlife is actually able to recover despite the radiation levels. It may also be that, given the emphasis on protection of populations as a primary goal, that individuals are actually able to successfully mate and reproduce before they die, perhaps at an earlier age than they would have otherwise if they would be in the absence of radiation. We therefore need to be able to consider and investigate these different theories behind these inconvenient truths. Some studies, though, do show results that may seem at odds with our understanding of radiation effects more generally, and these raise different types of questions. For example, in this study, there are reported effects on bees, butterflies, grasshoppers and dragonflies, where the abundance of each of these declines with increasing radiation levels. That in itself seems a reasonable expectation. However, if we take a closer look at the radiation levels being reported, these effects are being reported at levels that are lower than the benchmarks and the numeric criteria that have been established from databases on laboratory and field effect studies, as you can see here. So the decline in all of these insects, remembering too that the insects would historically have been considered as less radiosensitive than, say, mammals, are occurring in these contaminated sites at dose rates that we can test for real in the field around the benchmark levels. So perhaps the conclusion here that we should draw is that the benchmarks are simply in the wrong place, and that could be part of the story. However, there is one other issue, and that is if we overlay this figure with an indication of the natural background levels, then these declines in what we might think of as more radio-resistant species are occurring within the radiation of the UK natural background, and that makes less sense. So again, the data show a decline, but are all the relevant aspects being incorporated into the studies? Are we accounting for the radiation exposure correctly? Where are these individuals spending their time? Could the radiation that they have been exposed to be different to the levels that we're reporting? We can also see this for mammals as well. In this study, which is looking at the abundance of mammals within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, you can see here that as the radiation levels increase, then so too the number of mammals being reported decreases. This is a very significant p-value supporting the statistical significance of the relationship, but the r-squared value shows that this is not accounting for the variation in the data so well. The relationship also seems to be being driven by data points at the higher dose rate, and if we consider where these dose rates might occur within the Chernobyl exclusion zone, then it's likely that these are data points that were derived from the area known as the Red Forest. The Red Forest, though, is unique. Firstly, it is highly contaminated and suffered the loss of trees at the time of the accident, and the regrowth in the area is restricted. Secondly, it's close to the area around the nuclear power plant itself, and it's likely to still receive some anthropogenic disturbance from people working at the power plant. And as a consequence, it may not be the normal habitat that would be encountered by those animals. Furthermore, other studies, such as the one shown on the graph here, have indicated that mammal numbers in the exclusion zone within the Belarusian area have actually increased, apart from a notable drop in wild boar number around 1993-1994 due to an outbreak of swine flu. The study in Belarus investigated the areas with the dose rate ranges highlighted in the green box. So again, the question is, what is actually happening and what do we do to investigate this further? So that brings me onto a recent research program that's been funded in the UK called TREE. TREE looked at the transfer of radioactivity to wildlife and to humans. It looked at the exposure of wildlife to radiation in the field, and it looked at the effects of ionizing radiation on wildlife. The overall objective of the TREE project was to determine whether low-level chronic radiation exposure was actually significant effects on exposed populations in contaminated sites. And the research was conducted by researchers from 7 different organisations and funded by the UK Natural Environmental Research Council, the Environment Agency and Radioactive Waste Management. To undertake this research, we looked at a range of different organisms, ranging from plants, small and large mammals, Daphnia, bees, gammarids, fish, birds, all in controlled laboratory studies and field studies. We used camera traps and acoustic detectors to investigate the presence and abundance of different mammal species within the zone. Some of the findings from the TREE project are still being processed and written up, but what I would like to do here is to actually take a look at how the effects data that were generated might actually help us when we're considering the DCRLs that we mentioned earlier. So firstly, we're going to take a quick look at the findings from controlled laboratory facilities. We conducted experiments using both external and internal sources of radiation. For example, at Stirling, we built a facility for conducting long-term exposure experiments in a radiation field that covers the dose rate range encompassed by the lower bands within the DCRLs. Our longest experiment so far has been over the course of 6 months. In other studies, we exposed species to radionuclides in solution, and those studies were conducted on fish, invertebrates and plants. And if we can compare our findings to the DCRL bands, in this slide here you can see that for fish we saw no effects on embryo development within the DCRL range, but we did see a reduction in the success of and a delay in the hatching of eggs. For plants we didn't see any developmental effects at the bottom of the DCRL band, and for invertebrates we saw a reduction in the number of queens in bee colonies exposed within the facility, and that they had an increased parasite load with increasing radiation stress. In aquatic invertebrates we also saw effects on sperm quality, DNA damage and abnormal embryos within marine crustaceans. These effects on the invertebrates were below the DCRL band, suggesting that we might need to reconsider the position of the DCRL band. We also worked in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where we could see dose rates for some of the ICRP reference animals and plants that were in or above the relevant DCRL band. Here we saw no effect on mammal populations within the zone. For fish, we saw generally no effects at dose rates that were below the DCRL band, but there were some undeveloped gonads in some fish from 2 of the 3 contaminated lakes that we investigated. For soil invertebrates and for freshwater crustacea, we also saw no effects But we did see evidence of a change in age structure in the bees, with fewer old bees around in the higher radiation areas, which could possibly be linked to a recorded increase in the parasite load within the field. That was actually also observed in the laboratory studies. So these studies are helping us to test and check whether the DCRLs are set correctly. So in summary, we can and we should take note of the following. We should ensure that we improve our estimates of exposure, particularly when linking exposure to the effects observed in the field, as this could be one of the reasons why we see results at dose rates lower than we might logically expect. We can also use the data collected from past accidents, especially if these are combined with controlled laboratory studies where radiation is the single stressor, to develop our knowledge of radiation-induced effects, which could help us to better understand the biological mechanisms that might be involved. And these data will also allow us to build and test dose response models. And in some accident situations, we can explore the radiation effects in combination with other stressors and use all of these to help us to improve our guidance and recommendations for making and undertaking radiological risk assessments of the environment in the future.
David, thank you very much for your presentation. それでは次に、私の方から福島の環境中における、放射性セシウムということで、事故後のですね、放射性セシウムの、変遷についてお話ししたいというふうに思います。はい、環境中における、福島で事故があった後ですね、環境中において、主に放射性要素131と放射性のセシウム134と137が放出されたわけですが、主にここでは放射性セシウム、その中でも137。
Now, from my side, I would like to discuss the change in the concentration of the radioactive cesium after the accident. The change in the course of the time is my main topic of discussion. So the title says radiocesium in the environment of Fukushima. Mainly, our interest was the radioactive radionuclei, which is discharged to the atmosphere 131 and cesium 134 and 137. That we concentrated on the 137 with a half-life of 30 years. And we measured that the soil and atmosphere and irrigation water and crops and animal, wild animal, and seawater and marine life. And we are interested in a speciation of the radiocesium in soil and irrigation water. The change in the form of the existence and the internal and radiation dose rate through intake of the agricultural crops collected from the Fukushima will be discussed. That is the impact on the human body.
放射性各種の減衰になります。もう一つは環境中で放射性セシウムがどんどん移動しているということが要因となります。
This is a very well-known graph, the change of the ambient dose rate.
ここに示しますのは
change in the course of the time, as you can see, that from the nuclear plant of Fukushima, from the northeast, and there is a high concentration area, which came down in the course of the time. And this is the result of the measurement that we have taken. And there are two reasons of this decrease, mainly two: natural attenuation, which caused the change of ambient dose. Another is that in the environment that the radioactive cesium moved around, so that the attenuation and movement. So what are the changes in that atmosphere? This is the path of the change, as you can see. The samples are taken in many different locations, mainly that are controlled, and also that the Namie township, that the monitoring is still ongoing. And right after the accident, several millimeters of becquerel per cubic meter was observed quite high, and then it came down very significantly in several months to something like 1/3, and then it leveled off. And depending on the location, however, in 2014, you can see that comparing the Okuma, Date, and Fukushima, you can see that Date and Fukushima, that more or less that the concentration is comparable. However, the Okuma, that atmospheric concentration is high or stays to be high. And also it doesn't come down so easily in the case of the atmospheric concentration. Namiye is the same story. And in 2017, from the summer, it is coming down gradually. However, that there is not significantly in the atmosphere. Next, I would like to move on to the concentration in the soil. This is before the decontamination. Mainly, these are the farmland, and already the topsoil is mixed with the new soil. And then, as a farming depth is 15 to 20 centimeters in depth, and several hundred and 2,000 becquerel per cubic meters of concentration. But the Okuma of the test farm that you can see the 12,000 and the 9,200 becquerel, even though the soil is mixed. In case of the strontium-90, and after that the accident, just very close to the Okuma, that it was discharged to the atmosphere, however, that it was not significantly high in other areas. Thus, that the cesium, which is solidified, was settled in the soil. And so it solidifies very strong bonds, strong with the soil on the surface. And the right-hand side and the middle graph shows you the forest soil. And the sample extracted from the 2016, again, the cesium stays in the soil. However, in the paddy field, because of the plowing, that topsoil is evenly distributed, and therefore the up down to the 15 centimeters depth, you can see that there is an even distribution. Now, next I would like to move on to the result of the long term of monitoring from the 1959 to 2000. This is in Japan, that the in-soil concentration. And after the accident was compared here. Before the 2011 accident, several dozens of becquerel during the atmospheric of the nuclear experiment, it was high. But in 2000, the average came less than 10 becquerel. But after the accident, it jumped up again. And the average concentration went up all over Japan in 2011 and 12, and sometimes it went up to the 1,000 becquerel. In Fukushima, that is, and in some areas that it exceeded 1,000. Well then, why that the soil concentration does not come down so easily? There are several reasons. In the cesium in soil turned onto the positive ion, and therefore it was attracted and absorbed by the negatively charged organic matter. And on the other hand, there are the so-called, in the clay, frayed edge site. If the cesium is caught into this edge, it will not come down very easily. So these are the two main reasons. And if the cesium is absorbed to this site, it doesn't move around. Well then, fraction yield, which can be moved to the plant. What is the percentage of this in the course of the time? The change is like this. And this is RI tracer experiment results. The extraction yield comes down in the course of the time and starts with 60% after 300 days at 30%. And then further, this is a calculated for the global whole out, 30 years pass and then 5%. So gradually, that radioactive cesium is coming down from the extraction field yield, which is usable to the plant, to that the fraction which is very strongly bonded to the soil. The same observation was detected in Fukushima, and the soil samples of 2012, 30% are that extraction yield, and then it came down to about half in 1 year, but very strongly bonded fraction increased. And here that we also turn our eyes to the other nuclear radioactive substances, that it's very close to that the plant that the cobalt-60 was detected in 5 years radius from the several samples. And right now that we are also that calculating the scatter volume of the cobalt-60 discharge amount. As you know, cesium-137 and cobalt-60 that we have to handle quite a different way, and therefore that we have to take into the consideration of the specificity of the cobalt-60. Next, and this is a concentration change in that the irrigation water, especially the so-called dissolved substance, is very important. Mainly that the cesium of the positive ion, which can be absorbed by the plant. So this is a change. This is a Oguni plant, the 55 kilometers northwest from the plant. The sample was extracted from this, and it used to be the concentration of the rice was very high. That was a starting point. In 2013 to 2019, that you can see that gradually but significantly the concentration in rice came down. Irrigation water came down. In 2014, just around 80 kilometers of radius of the plant from many different locations that we extracted the water from irrigation ponds. Again, right next to the plant, the cesium concentration is very high in the form of a dissolution, and the further away, the lower the concentration of the dissolved fraction. So against this backdrop, that we have to be very careful of the concentration of the cesium of the rice. So since 2012, that the monitoring was 100% applied. Approximately 10 million of the rice bags were inspected every year. But in 2014, that was the last year, the 100 or more becquerel of that the concentration was detected in rice. As for the Fukushima rice, from the very old ones, from the atmospheric nuclear experiment age to at present, the red dot represents Fukushima. Before that accident, it was all scattered in the national average, but it went up slightly after 2011. But right now, it came down to several becquerel, and therefore, that compared with the other areas, it is slightly higher. However, that there is no change, and compared with the other crops. And we extract this sample from the soil as well as the other crops. By the proper management, as you can see, that the concentration of the crops came down significantly. But on the other hand, in Okuma, the concentration originally high, and for those crops grown here, is a cesium-137 concentration remains to be high. But right at this moment, that the concentration is far lower than these figures, we know. Well, these are the concentration of strontium-90. So that there is no significant difference between the concentration of strontium-90 comparing the inside and outside of Fukushima. Next, I would like to move to the concentration in the body of the wild animals. Here, this is a result of monitoring in Fukushima. And in many wild animals, those are the concentration of the 134 and 137 cesium. On the left-hand side, compared with the other wild animals, that the concentration is high and also widely distributed in case of wild boar. Wild boar, as David-san reported, that in Fukushima they are breeding very rapidly. And on average, this is an average change year to year. In 2011, the average concentration was over 1,000. Right now, it came down to around 100 becquerel. So this was one digit down. So as to that wild animals, even though that they live in the hard to return area, their concentration inside of the body is gradually coming down. So this is the observation we made. Another interesting observation is that the larger size animals, bears and the wild animals, that concentration in the muscles presented the seasonal change. Next, the concentration in the seawater. In 1980s and in 1990s, and from this to the present, this is a concentration of that temporal water. In the East Japan, it went down very quickly after the accident. Well, 3-digit higher. And then it came down very low, but it is hardly coming down to 0.01 becquerel. Is the pre-accident. In West Japan again, that there was a marked increase after 2011, but came down and stable. And on the Japan seaside, it went up very gradually. There was an increase of 137, came down and stabilized. And similarly, this is a marine biota, marine products. And it was coming down gradually. Before the accident, it went up suddenly and came down gradually. However, the speed of coming down is slower than the seawater. We are trying to find out the reasons for this through the researchers. And also that the West Japan, that the certain marine species showed that the higher concentration, and also the Japan seaside also, it went down gradually but came down quickly. And they are returned back to the pre-accident figures. Now, how about the exposure to the human beings? And these are the result of the Fukushima data of internal and external exposure is shown. As for the external exposures, it was distributed, dosimeter, it was distributed to the citizens, and they took the data. And the internal exposure was calculated from the inhalation and intake of food. One thing that we can say is that compared with the external exposure, internal exposure is 5% or less. Now, the exposure, if we extend the range to the 2012, 13 to 15 and 16, and then up until that the radiocesium mean was very high, up until 2012 in the crop, however, it came down to 2 becquerel, and it came down again. So the internal dose in 2012, 0.066 millisievert, is right now is to the 0.016 or 0.0919. So accordingly, conclusion, activity concentration of the radiocesium in the environment is decreasing with time. Transfer the radiocesium to plant, animal, and the human also decreased due to attenuation, movement, and change of the fractions. And the radiation dose to the human is less than 1 millisievert of the additional radiation dose, and the internal dose was extremely limited compared to the external dose.
それでは関谷先生よろしくお願いします。
Thank you very much for your attention. 今日は風評問題というテーマでお話をさせていただきたいというふうに思います。私は原子力災害、自然災害に関する社会心理学的研究を続けてまいりました。特に東日本大震災以降は、原子力災害の社会心理学的研究、これを注力して進めて、原子力関係、風評関係では、さまざまな国や福島県、新潟県さんのおける問題で、それぞれの問題も変わっている。
Thank you very much for the introduction. My name is Sekiya from Tokyo University. I would like to discuss over the stigma and the reputational damage after the triple disaster. I have been always interested as a scholar of natural and man-made accidents. And from the social and psychological point of view, after the Great East Earthquake, I have been involved in the Nuclear Accident Investigation Committee of the government of Japan. I was deeply involved in the survey of the reputational damage. And at present, that I sit in the committee responsible for the opinion survey of the post-disaster of Fukushima. And also, I'm involved in the Kashiwazaki-Kariya Nuclear Plant Disaster Mitigation Committee. And this was a picture 2 years ago in Fukushima City, the Straw Sandal Festival. Well, unfortunately, the coronavirus forced us to cancel this event, but it has been a very popular summer festival of the Nakadori and also the coastal area. People are starting to come back to their former homes. And the standard value is 100 becquerel per kilograms, and anything which is underneath of this is allowed to ship out the agricultural product and the marine products. And the fact is that the rice is 100% subject to the 100% inspection since 2012, and after 2017. And this is a general survey. However, ever since the fiscal 2017, no rice bag has calculated to be over the standard, or that the amount is so small that the radioactive substances, the concentration is so low, so it is non-discernible, or that the marginal error is greater. So this is a result of the inspection. So that the rice is quite safe right now, and therefore the 100% inspection is lifted, or relaxed, I should say. Right after the accident, there have been a lot of bad reputation and the damage by this. And that many of the general consumers are very afraid, and which was transferred to the distributors. And the distributors refrain from the purchasing the product from Fukushima. Right now that we have hardly see any of the complaints for the general consumers, but that the complaints or that the perceptions lingers on, and still some of the distributors or wholesalers cannot remove totally that avoid the bad feeling for that Fukushima products. So this is a challenge that we have to appease the mind of the distributors especially. And this is the change in the surveys in the course of the time. Since 2013, 14, and 15, and 17 that we have conducted these research. And the results of this, that the sense of resistance against the products produced in Fukushima, it is coming down. About 30% of hesitation came down to less than 10%. And outside of the Fukushima prefecture was started with a 30%, but 15%. However, that compared with out of that the Fukushima prefecture, that the Fukushima people are more tolerant to the products, or they sometimes prefer this. And there isn't too much of the fear of the health, fear, the uneasiness of the health. Why that the people are less fearful of the radiation, especially over the products? There are several reasons against this, for this. Well, many people say that the products are 100% subject to 100% the inspection, and also if there are any of that the products above the standard, they are prohibited to be shipped. So because of this knowledge, they have the peace in mind. That's the main reason. Well, this is very conspicuous among the people in Fukushima. And in Fukushima, more than 80% of the Fukushima people know that the Fukushima rice is subject to 100% inspection. But outside of the Fukushima, 40%, only 40% know. And also that among the Fukushima people, the 60 or more people know that even though that's 100% inspection turned out to be ND, non-discernible. But outside of the prefecture, 20%, only 20% no. In short, 100% inspection or very low dosage, non-discernible, and this peace of mind differed significantly outside and inside of the Fukushima. In the past 10 years, more and more people are comfortable of that the products in Fukushima, but there is a gap between that inside and outside of Fukushima, and also that not too many media report on this point of the assurance. That sometimes has a rather negative impact. Another important challenge is the contaminated water and how to treat the contaminated water. This has been the concern of the people. Concern, therefore, the challenge. In Fukushima, that all that the restriction of the shipping of the food stuff to the over that the prefectural border was lifted in February of this year. And we conducted the survey with the Fukushima University as well as NHK and did the opinion survey. And among the fishermen or the Fukushima citizens, we asked them, what are the biggest concerns after the accident? Number one, that the treatment of the contaminated water and bad reputation. These two are the biggest concern of theirs. Outside of the Fukushima, they are more interested in assistance or economic revitalization, but inside of the Fukushima, contaminated water and bad reputation are undoubtedly two biggest concerns. But if we ask them that what is your preference of the treating or disposal of the treated water, opinions vary. That the government started the task force of the final disposal of the treated water, and there are several options: discharge into the seawaters, and injection into the ground, and evaporation, and hydrogen evaporation, and there are several candidates, or temporary storage. And we pose the same question to the local citizens. And in this, that the temporary storage is number one preference, and the second preference is the discharge into the sea. But the biggest point that I would like to attract your attention to is that the biggest chunk is I don't know. So that many people cannot make up their minds yet what to do with the treated water. Injection into the ground, disposal into the seas, evaporation. There are candidates, but they don't know. They can't decide. Some people are clearly opposed, clearly for, but a big portion of the people say that I cannot decide. I don't know. Why so many people are undecided? Well, many people say that ultimately we have to dispose of the treated water, but now is a time. Now is a bad time, they say, because the bad reputation is just about to be coming down, and also that restriction of the operation is just about to be lifted over the fisheries. So this is a bad time of discharging of the treated water, because this may bring the damage again to the local fishery operations. Some people say that the market level is recovered only to the 10%. And then if the treated water is discharged to the sea, again that the customers turn away from the products from Fukushima. That's our fear. And from the consumption point of view, consumers' point of view, after the accident, that as for the agricultural product and the marine products, that less and less consumers are shying away from the Fukushima products. That about 20%, just 20% of the people say that they don't want to purchase the Fukushima products. But 20% is a high level for that distributors. When we ask the distributors says that, oh, the consumers, 50% of the consumers are worried, but the actual number is 20%. So that the wholesalers, especially, tend to not to buy the marine products from Fukushima. Wholesalers, many of them, consider that it is safer not to purchase the fishery product from Fukushima. So that the fear or uneasiness of the consumers are reflected directly to the distributors and wholesalers. And if that the treated contaminated water is discharged, the consumer said, 30% of the people say that they don't want to purchase the marine. Right now it's 20%. And the 30% say that if the contaminated water is discharged, treated, that water is discharged, I don't want to buy the product. 30% of them say that they don't want to purchase from the Fukushima, increased by 10%. So yes, that we have to be ready that Alps treated water discharge into the seawater may have the impact on the fishery. For the matter of the 10%, especially on the side of the Pacific Ocean side, we have to take this into consideration before deciding whether that we should discharge the treated water into the seawater. Now the summary. That after 2017, no rice product has been produced that above the standard, that the radiation, also that we are providing the safe products and safety assured products. But the bad reputation is a psychological thing, and also the issue of the distribution, and therefore that we cannot 100% array the fears of the marine product and agricultural product produced in Fukushima. 100% is impossible. But we have to have a good understanding of the trend of the consumption and their psychological conditions. So that we have to keep on working very hard to regain the trust. We have to learn from the past, or that the accident took place 10 years ago, and have to keep on dispatching the correct information, both to Japanese consumers and overseas consumers. It's a big challenge. The second mission of ours is periodically we have to survey the status of psychological conditions as well as the trend of the consumption. This is a very important element. Periodical survey. Number 3, in the past 10 years, that some of the trust among the marine products, agricultural products of the Fukushima was gone, partly gone, but we have to regain it for the next 10 years. With this, after 10 years, that many of the inspection is relaxed or terminated. But after the termination of the inspection, that the Fukushima products still are very safe, that we have to keep on persuading that the consumers, that is, that we have to let them understand the safety of the Fukushima products. With this 10 years as one milestone, that we have to keep on working into the future for the next decades. Thank you.
JHPS 国際シンポジウムのまとめについて報告します。東北大学
Synthesis of JHPS
福
conference
島第
on
一原子力
tritium.
発電所の廃炉が進む中、
I am
ト
Yoshida
リチウ
from
ム製を
Tohoku
どう扱うか
University.
という問題に社会的な関心が
As
高まっています。
decommissioning of Fukushima Daiichi progresses, there is growing interest from society on how tritium water will be handled. Alps treated water is defined as purified water treated through multiple purification equipment such as advanced liquid processing system. The storage tank is expected to become full around summer 2022. On February 10, 2020, a report was published by ALPS Subcommittee at METI. The report stated that it's technically possible and safe to dilute tritium water and release it into ocean. However, voices of concern on tourism, fishing, health, and negative rumors were raised not only from areas near the nuclear plant, but also from fishermen and residents along the coast. With this concern at the backdrop, JHPS Japan Health Physics Society held a web live symposium on June 29th on 2020. It was called International Symposium, How Do We Find the Solution to Radiological Protection of Tritium Water? In the first section, we had JHPS member Mr. Yamaguchi, and from Taiwan Atomic Energy Council, we had Shu Jun Chang, and from National University of Science and Technology in Seoul, we had Ik Jang Chung, and community activist Mr. Komatsu, and fisherman Mr. Kikuchi. And in the second section, we had from Fukushima Ethos, Miss Ando, and live discussion. And we had the topic, scientific safety of tritium water and societal consequences, building consensus. And I'm going to introduce you to the interview of fisherman Kikuchi, who was not able to attend. So, Motofumi Kikuchi was born in Soma, and he's a fisherman. So this is an excerpt from his interview. So the safety of tritium water, I think it's just that people do not understand the issue. People say it's safe, but they don't know how this process was reached. And we have to make our living, we have to just do our job. And this contaminated water, it's a responsibility of those who contaminated our workplace, the ocean. So they must really try to understand the fishermen. That is the only humanistic way to deal with the issue. If they just give us money and say, why don't you use this money until there is restoration, it doesn't solve problem. And he said this is not just an issue for the fishermen or for Fukushima. It's not someone else's problem. It has to be dealt as own problem. And the fishing is really thrilling, because they can, if they fish, they can get the money. And they said that they would like the government to make effort to restore the attractiveness and culture of fishing. And in the second live discussion, I'd like to summarize the discussion. So, first, in order to get the trust of the people towards tritium water, what should be specifically done? To whom what is demanded, and what can be improved through this process? Mr. Yamaguchi said that the issue is the issue of trust. Mr. Chang said that tritium water is an issue of safety. So there needs to be the risk evaluation, and we want that Japan to really disclose information. And Mr. Chung from Korea said, how much safety is enough? Of course, scientific knowledge and scientific research data is important, but that's just the bottom line. Even if you emphasize zero risk, it doesn't lead to anything. We need to make room for discussion through negotiation. And most of the information is given through mass media. And it really affects the decision making of the public. Scientists must, it's important for scientists to explain in a manner that public can understand. Mr. Komatsu said that scientists must disclose information based on data. However, most of the consumers, they do not act upon the understanding of scientific knowledge on tritium. If somebody else says it's safe, they may think it's safe. So the mass media and the information transmitter must explain and also coordinate with the scientists. And there needs to be a communicator who will be a bridge between scientific data and the public. Ms. Ando said, if we talk about tritium water, there's no trust towards the authority which transmits the primary information. And she sent a message on SNS confirming the information from TEPCO, but that led to the loss of trust on her part. So there's no one who really transmits information who is reliable. So we might need a third-party authority who monitors the information. The second is consensus building. After the accident at Fukushima Daiichi, there were many important decisions made in various phases. And these decisions, they were based on scientific rationale, but it was not solely made on scientific basis. And the consensus building were not done fully beforehand. And there were many people who were marginalized from making such decisions, and there are still such people who exist today. So we need to have social consensus building, and we discussed about what is needed to make consensus building. Mr. Yamaguchi says that we need an explanation that everything has been reviewed and dealt, and also that we need multiple perspectives. Mr. Chang said that Japanese government needs to build an important decision-making network, and that kind of network needs to explain what is done to be done, where, who is going to do it. Japanese government needs to explain the reason for releasing tritium water and how and when, who will do it. These needs to be explained in detail. Mr. Chung from Korea said one of the keywords is consensus building, and the bottom line is acceptability and reliance. So trust is the most important word. especially in making consensus, there is a negotiation of give and take. So the government and the community needs to tell each other that interest will not be violated. So the parties need to build confidence. Mr. Komatsu says that it's been already 9 years after the accident, and there's fewer people, even in that region, who has interest in this issue. So there's a disparity between people who holds interest, who has interest, and who do not have interest. So not just the mass media, but we need forum for information exchange in local places. So even if it's a small forum, we need to take time to build a forum for discussion. And Ms. Ando says also that we need to take time. Conclusion giving cannot be accepted, even whatever the conclusion is. And we had comments and questions from the audience. So let me summarize the live discussion. So information disclosure and transmitting information within Japan and abroad is necessary. And the information transmitter needs to be reliable. That is the key. Safety is an issue of trust, and experts need to play their role in a sincere manner. Scientific knowledge and scientific research data are important, but that's just the bottom line. We need specific negotiation. And the parties need to build confidence in a practical manner. The safety of tritium is not understood by majority of people. So we need a communicator who explains scientific data to the public. The conclusion given cannot be accepted, whatever the conclusion. We need to make forum for discussion in community and take time to do it. And this tritium water issue is not just an issue for fishermen. It's not just an issue for Fukushima. We should not trivialize this issue to regional problem. We must look at this issue as our own issue. So we need empathy, not sympathy. So lastly, as JHPS, we thought our role is not just to look at this safety technical issue, but we need to look at societal, social issues as well, and to support the solution. We are an expert on radiation protection, so what can we do? What should we do? It's important that we keep on thinking about this issue. Thank you.
さらに、このトリチウム水の問題に関して、漁業者だけの問題ではないということ。福島や地域だけの問題でもないということ。トリチウム水問題を地域の問題に歪償化しないようにする姿勢が重要である。ですが、他人事でなく自分のこととして考える姿勢、つまりシンパシーではなくエンパシー、この姿勢が必要であるということが結論としてあると思います。以上、まとめましたが、最後に日本保健物理学会の役割として、放射線防護の視点から安全性の技術的な問題だけでなく、社会的な課題にも目を向け、解決に向けた支援を行うべきであるということが改めて認識されました。 放射線防護の専門家集団である本学科の役割として何をなすべきか、何ができるか、今回のシンポジウムでの議論をベースに、我々自身もさらに考えていくことが必要であるというふうに思います。今日ご清聴ありがとうございました。
どうも吉田先生、ありがとうございました。それではこのセッションの最後のスピーカーを紹介します。I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Dr. Deborah Orton from Norway University of Life Science. She talked about ethical dimension to sustainable development in contaminated ecosystem. Deborah, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm just turning on my video here. Having a bit of trouble. Right, here we go. And share my screen. Here we go. I presume everybody can hear me okay?
Okay, I can see that.
You can hear. Right, and is the screen on? Can you see my presentation okay?
Okay, please.
Okay, great. Let's go. Sorry, I'm a little bit late, but here we go. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I'm going to give a short presentation, let's check the time, on ethical dimension to sustainable development in contaminated ecosystem. And to do this, I'm basing the talk a little bit on work I've been doing recently for the UNESCO World Commission on Ethics of Scientific Knowledge and Technology. We've been working on a number of issues to do with environmental contamination and basically general environmental issues. Why is an area vulnerable to radioactivity? And we will have heard from talks previously, there are a lot of scientific and technical things that impact on vulnerability, high transfer to low to foodstuffs, for example, soil properties, nutrient statement, everything to do with the environment itself. And there are obviously long biological half-lives and ecological half-lives. Radiosensitivity can be an issue to do with vulnerability as well, and multiple stressors. But what I want to also stress today is vulnerability of an ecosystem can also come down to ethical and social factors. And this example from Norway, I think it's a good example because it shows both the reindeer herder ecosystem, which is vulnerable because of high transfer, but it's also vulnerable because of societal factors on the livelihood of, for example, the reindeer herders. So we're bearing this in mind when we're going on. It's a different type of things influencing on vulnerability. Work done in Commerce recently to underline this. We published a declaration on ethical principles in relation, for example, to climate change. And 6 ethical principles here that I think can be applied to just about any environmental problem. A, to prevent harm, the precautionary approach, the need to be focused on equity and justice, the way in which environmental stresses often cause differences in distribution of risks and benefits in environment and the people affected by that environmental contamination. The need to be aware of the sustainable development side of any kind of environmental challenge, solidarity both between different people and everything dependent on the environment for its survival. And of course, the importance of scientific knowledge and research integrity. And they underlined in this, and I think there are very many other presentations in this conference that underline the importance of stakeholder engagement, transparency, and recognition of ethical challenges. So just to give you some examples of what we actually mean by this when it comes to environmental contamination. Another work that we carried out was looking at anything to do with the ethical challenges of all kind of water management. And just to show that this is not just radioactive pollution that causes these kinds of challenges. For example, plastic pollution is a great example, well, not a great example, but an example of the kind of ways in which environmental pollution causes particularly harms on vulnerable or minority populations. It has influence on consumer trust and risk perception. For example, the potential for contamination of foodstuffs by plastics, and virtually just about any contamination can cause consumer trust issues. There is, particularly when it comes to the plastic challenge, unclear legal and regulatory responsibilities, particularly that borderline with freshwater, coastal and marine. And I think we see that specifically as well with management of radiation pollution too, and conflicting values on how we value the ecosystem. So a couple of words about sustainable development. A lot of these challenges recognize that in sustainable development, there are these three pillars: the pillars of society, the pillars of economy, and the environment itself. And the challenge for sustainable development goals is to balance these impacts on economy, on society, and on the environment. And if we look at these sustainable development goals, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, and they are an excellent tool to guide us in any kind of environmental management and sustainable development challenges. But what is often not very well appreciated is the degree to which these sustainable development goals can actually come in conflict with each other's, particularly those goals that come most into conflict are those that deal with the environment, 14 and 15, the life below water, the life on land, and clashes with that with the need for example, decent work and economic growth and zero hunger and good health and well-being. So sometimes these goals do come into conflict, and it's important to recognize that if we're facing environmental challenges. This has had more focus now. Recently started off with a paper in Nature to map those interactions between sustainable development goals and to have more understanding on the ethical challenges actually that underline some of those clashes between the goals, particularly when you have clashes between society, economy and environmental well-being. Okay, so I also said some of the challenges in environmental perception and in environmental management are actually valuing the environment. And we can ask that question two ways. We can look at the ethical way in valuing the environment and also in the context of radiological protection. And in any kind of environmental valuation, again, this underlines some of those challenges with those clashes of sustainable development goals. So any environment will have a whole range of different types of values and different ways in which humans and the ecosystem itself, ecosystem services, humans and other species need that environment for resources. So it can be valued in terms of, for example, tourism. It can be valued in terms of the resources of that environment. There are also aesthetic reasons, the aesthetic beauty of environments, its heritage, cultural heritage, and in terms of economy, ecosystem services can also be used to underline the actual great deal of money that can be made from the resources of an environment, but also the way in which there are feedback loops, the way in which both humans are dependent on those resources, animals, other living species are dependent on those resources, and the interdependency. And this is that principle of solidarity, to recognize the different ways in which environment can be valuable for humans and other living entities. So based on this, there has been quite a bit of work on developing protection of the environment by ICRP, the framework, starting from 2002. And these challenges, particularly the ethical ways, the different ways in which different entities, both humans and animals, may value the environment. So humans can also have different perspectives on valuing the environment, was also touched on in the scientific work done on developing this framework for protection of environment. Other work carried on looking at the ethical aspects addressed during developing the system. The IEAA was quite early out in looking at these ethical considerations, also protecting the environment, and IUR as well, looking at ecosystem focus. Okay, so very many people have focused on this, but what hasn't really been touched on in such great development is this way in which, when we're bringing in the Sustainable Development Goals, these also add a different level of challenges in dealing with radiological hazards. So stakeholder involvement, this also has been a key thing running through all work on protection of the environment from the start, like any kind of accidental management, but not just radiation accidents, any kind of work on protection of the environment has highlighted the importance of stakeholder engagement, has highlighted the, as quoted here, the development of policy being conducted in an open and transparent way. Also, to recognise that the humans are an integral part of the environment. So in developing that framework for environmental protection, that it's recognising again the solidarity integrated between human needs and the needs of other members of the living world. And also a key point here, because I have been mentioning how these issues to do with sustainable development, environmental risk assessment are challenges for obviously radioactive contaminated ecosystems, but the same general principles should be applied to protection of all contaminants, that we should be using the same ways of assessment for radiation and other environmental stressors, and all environmental stressors cause these kind of challenges. So just two quick cases before I finish. I say I've got about 5 minutes left to illustrate just some of these challenges. The rezoning of Chernobyl contaminated territories, and this is a strategy that started 2016 to open up some of these areas for resettlement and alternative use. And in doing that discussion on how best to reuse or rezone Chernobyl territories, this did bring the rise to these things we've seen earlier about different ways of valuing this ecosystem. So it can be valued in the terms of an ecosystem itself, the 30-kilometer zone, for example, becoming a natural reserve. So there's that value of that particular kind of ecosystem. The cultural heritage, it's a very interesting area in the sense that time has almost stood still in many cases since the rise of glasnost and cultural heritage in terms of late 1980s state of the former Soviet Union. Research and development, there's a lot of work going on, for example, alternative energy uses, also research and development in the sense of molecular biology and different types of genetically modified organisms. But particularly, most importantly, I think the kinds of energy research and development that's going on in that area, of course, as well as the research looking at the behavior of the radionuclides in the area. Cultural heritage I've mentioned. But again, one of the biggest challenges, and anyone who's been working in the Chernobyl 30-kilometer zone will know the big challenges from tourism that have grown up. And for example, over 80,000 visitors to the exclusion zone in 2019. So these are all ways of which, perfectly legitimately ways of valuing this particular ecosystem and needing to have the discussion and have the debate on how best to develop the ecosystem and this area in terms of recognizing these particular different ways in which a ecosystem can be valued. Other questions that come up from the Chernobyl 30 kilometers, and particularly looking at how we evaluate the changes in that ecosystem. So when does change become harm? How do we evaluate impacts on biodiversity, conservation and preservation? We all know that there was a big change in that ecosystem in the sense of the red forest dying off, but that led to a new ecosystem. The ecosystem has definitely changed, but how to monitor whether that ecosystem is thriving or not. And that causes us to again think about different ways of describing ecosystem, both in scientific and ethical and social perspectives. Finally, I've used this example before, but I think this is a good example to finish with, to recognize again the complexity in doing any kind of environmental impact of any kind of ecosystem, particularly the marine contamination. I know this is a tricky subject today, but again, to be aware of the very many different kinds of impacts one can have on any kind of ecosystem from any kind of intervention. So, and again, this goes much more than, for example, radiation impacts on marine species, which could be absolutely negligible, and the more significant consequences being on economic issues from loss of sales due to particularly due to consumer trust. And that's a thing to really, I think, has to be bared in mind on any kind of discussion, the complexity and the different types of consequences. For example, it's not just direct loss from sales, decrease in market value of marine products. And of course, there are some savings if we're doing a full assessment of the economic consequences from fishing subsidies. There are environmental benefits of fishing bans as well, but there are also the effects in marine organisms, and any kind of remediation often has massive environmental side effects that one would argue would go way beyond the potential effects of the radiation itself. And I think the biggest impacts that we have to make sure we address in any kind of assessment, the sociological and democratic consequences from loss of livelihood of fishermen, but also loss of access to sites of cultural or community heritage. So I hope you see that these give just some small examples of the perspective of things that one needs to look at if we're taking a sustainable development approach to management of any kind of ecosystem, and to really think quite deeply about the consequences of those interventions. So to conclude, holistic evaluation, not only the impacts of ionizing radiation, but also the direct consequences on health of humans, but the complex social, ecological, ethical, and economic consequences of pollution in any vulnerable ecosystem. We think environmental ethics can foster interaction between environmental science. We've seen, as I hope I've shown with the COMEST work, that these kind of challenges are not limited to radiation issues. There are other kinds of environmental hazards that it's worth comparing radiation to. But I think the underlining take-home message of the talk today, that there are some fundamental clashes between environmental sustainable development goals that hopefully we will become more aware of as we navigate the the path through this challenging area. Okay, I'll finish. I think my time's up. Thank you for your attention, and I presume there may be some time for questions. I don't know. I'll hand back to I'll stop sharing my screen. Should I do that? Yep. Then you can maybe see me.
Deborah, thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay, thank you. No problem.
それでは we continue to question time, and これから質疑応答を少し行いたいと思います。いくつか Q&A でいただいていますので、そこから少し拾ってみたいと思います。塚田先生、よろしいでしょうか。塚田先生、聞こえますか。塚田先生、野生動物の野ウサギが多めな感じがしたと、そのイノシシと違っているようだということですが、その辺についてお考えございますか。
はい、今実はウサギは非常に採取量が少ないので、 実はイノシシについて、胃の内容物と筋肉の関係というのはかなり調べられていまして、やっぱり性の相関がある。やっぱ食べ物の濃度が高くなると、もちろん筋肉の濃度が高くなっていくんですが、何を食べてるかということについては、実は非常にそれを同定するのは難しくて、まだよく分かっていない点が多いです。はい。
はい。ありがとうございます。それから久保田さんいらっしゃいますか？
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm trying to get the interpretation on.
Oh, you,
I think I got it now.
can you find the interpretation log in?
Yeah, and now I've pressed on English, yes.
久保田さんいらっしゃいますか？染色体のことで少し質問があったようですけど、久保田さんいらっしゃらないかな？久保田さんいらっしゃらない。そうしますと。
今久保田さん入られました。
久保田さんいらっしゃいますか？
今、聞いちゃったな。
いらっしゃらない。
いらっしゃらない。
すいません、今、解除しました。
久保田さん、少しいくつか質問があるので、一つだけちょっと取り上げますと、
はい。
ネズミの2種類で、
はい、
1000回以上が検出されたりされなかったりしたということなんですが、それはどうしてなんだろうかということです。はい、種類によって最初の二道元体のが違ったんですかね。
傾向としては、二道元体も、それから、点座型染色体も、傾向としては一緒です。同じ場所では同じような、傾向で染色体異常が出たという結論ですけども。
両方のネズミともですね。
はい。
はい。ありがとうございました。
はい。
それでは、塚田先生の何か質問ございますか？
今の久保田さんのに関してなんですが、いわゆる中程度の線量とおっしゃった、はい、次のところでちょっと上がってると言ったんですが、はいはい、質問の中から、これ、N を増やせば有意差出る可能性がありますかっていう。
はい、そうですね、その通りだと思います。かなり微妙な線で、統計処理の仕方を変えるとですね、有意差が出たり出なかったりするっていうのが中線量地域のネズミですので、数をもっと増やさなきゃいけないというふうに言われることは確かだと思います。
はい、ありがとうございました。はい、
ありがとうございました。かなり細かい質問たくさんございますけど、またウェブの方で回答できる範囲でしていきたいと思います。最後に、せっかくデボラ来てますので、デボラ、can I ask you a question? Okay? Can you hear me? Deborah?
Yep.
Yeah, you were talking about SDGs. And could you explain the interaction between radiation protection and other environmental ethics?
Other environmental ethics or other environmental pollutants? Yes.
Yeah.
I think environmental ethics should be across the board. I think the ethical principles that gather or ethical principles that should underlie our dealing with any kind of environmental stressors should be the same. So the principles of being particularly sensitive to impacts on vulnerable populations and being sensitive to the societal consequences of pollution, I think are across the board. I don't think that is radiation should be special in any way.
Yeah.
So I think the ethical principles should be the same. Of course, we do have a big challenge with radiation because of the perception of radiation, which is seen to be a particularly tricky kind of pollutant in terms of public opinion on radiation. I think we have to acknowledge that. But it's not the only one that they are concerned about. And it's actually not the only one that impacts also on things like consumer trust in products. That goes to other contaminations like mercury as well. There's also perceptions there.
I would now like to sum up. In the first section, there were presentations about the behavior of radioactive substances. The concentration in the environment is gradually decreasing, and even in wild animals, the levels are very low. However, on the other hand, we need to look at the long-term impact on wildlife, and although we have a presentation focused on the ethics in the environment. On the other hand, as for domestic matters in Japan, there is an issue of contaminated water. And even though this is a controllable issue, there is a high level of interest from society, and we need to be able to communicate the facts effectively in order to reach a consensus within society. So we had a very wide range of speakers for this session, and I'd like to thank you very much for your cooperation. Thank you very much. Professor Tsukada, would you like to say a few words? No, thank you. You summed it up perfectly. Thank you very much. So this will conclude today's session.
ありがとうございました。
塚田先生、一言よろしいですか？
もう甲斐先生まとめていただいたので結構です。
どうもありがとうございました。それではまた今日のセッションはこれで終了いたします。